In my last lecture, I introduced two criteria that all good arguments must meet. They must be sound, and of course, if they're sound, they must be valid. Now, I also assessed some arguments from Milton Friedman's famous paper, The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits. And in this lecture, what I'm going to be doing is taking a look at some more arguments from Friedman. I'm not going to look at all of them. What I'm going to be doing is looking at the ones that I think are the most important that we take a look at. And for each argument, like before, I'm going to be assessing its quality. So just like last time, my lecture is going to be heavily influenced by a paper by Sean McAleer, and his paper is called Friedman's Stockholder Theory of Corporate Moral Responsibility, and it was published in the November 2003 edition of Teaching Business Ethics. So the first argument I'm going to be talking about from Friedman is called the principal-agent argument. In his capacity as a corporate executive, the manager is the agent of the individuals who own the corporation or establish the eleemosynary institution, and his primary responsibility is to them. Now, in order to assess this argument, I need to express it more clearly. We need to identify its parts and express those parts clearly. So, premise one, corporate executives are the agents of the owners of their corporation. Premise two, an agent's primary responsibility is to look after the interests of her principal. Conclusion, a corporate executive's primary responsibility is to look after the interests of the owners of her corporation. So the argument is valid. The problem with it is that even if it is sound, the conclusion isn't strong enough for the purposes that Friedman needs. It won't do what Friedman needs it to do. So recall that I argue that his position is that the only responsibility of a business is to make a profit while staying within the limits of the law. But even if we grant him all the other things that he mentioned, so even if we grant him the extra legal constraints involving ethical customs and the avoidance of deception and fraud, the conclusion of the agent-principal argument is still much too weak for his purposes. So here's why. When I say that my primary responsibility is to do X, that leaves open the possibility that there's some other responsibilities to do something Y that I have as well. So for example, if I'm driving, my primary responsibility is to keep my eyes on the road and drive safely. But if I'm driving you to an important job interview, I also have a responsibility to you to drive efficiently. If I have promised a friend that I'll arrive at their house at a particular time in order to take them to the doctor, I also have a responsibility to them that I drive efficiency. Right? So that's an additional responsibility in addition to the responsibility to drive safely, which is my primary responsibility every time I get behind the wheel. So the problem with his argument is that it's not that it's invalid, it's not that it's unsound, it's that it fails to accomplish what he needs it to accomplish. It concludes only that a corporate executive's primary responsibility is to look after the interests of the owners of the corporation. And this really weak conclusion leaves it completely open whether a corporate executive has other responsibilities as well. So you might think that Friedman could just modify his argument by replacing the word primary with the word only. And that would look something like this. Now this new argument gets Friedman the conclusion he wants. But the problem with it is that premise 2 is wildly implausible. Is it really true that my stockbroker's only responsibility in the workplace is to look after my interests? Doesn't she also have responsibilities to her fellow employees, her boss, and a whole host of others who are affected by her behavior? Of course, it's not the case that her only responsibility is to the principal, for whom she is an agent. So this argument is just not sound. The second argument I'm going to be looking at is called the taxation argument. And it goes something like this. Insofar as his actions, in accord with his social responsibility, reduce returns to stockholders, he is spending their money. Insofar as his actions raise the price to customers, he is spending the customers' money. Insofar as his actions lower the wages of some employees, he is spending their money. If he does this, he is in effect imposing taxes on the one hand, and deciding how the tax proceeds shall be spent on the other. So as before, the first step in assessing this argument is going to be to break down into its parts and reconstruct it. So let's do that now. Premise 1. If a corporate executive engages in a socially responsible project, he or she will spend money that otherwise would have gone to stockholders, customers, and employees. Premise 2, spending money on socially responsible projects that otherwise would have gone to stockholders, customers, and employees is taxation. Premise 3, it is wrong in principle for corporate executives to engage in taxation. Premise 4, the practical consequences of corporate executives engaging in taxation are bad. Conclusion 1, therefore it is wrong in principle for corporate executives to engage in socially responsible projects. Conclusion 2, therefore it is bad in practice for corporate executives to engage in socially responsible projects. So the first thing that I want to note about this argument is that looking out for the financial interests of employees and customers can be seen as a form of corporate social responsibility. Because what you're doing is you're doing something that isn't narrowly concerned with just, making a profit while staying within the ethical custom and rules against deception and fraud insofar as those things are found in the law, or even as they're understood as plausible extra legal constraints. For this reason, it appears as though Friedman is helping himself to premises that are inconsistent with his overall conclusion. So to help Friedman, I'm going to reformulate his argument as follows. P1, if a corporate executive engages in a socially responsible project, he or she will spend money that otherwise would have gone to stockholders. So what I'm doing here is I'm removing the customers and removing the employees from the equation, and we're focusing only on the interests of stockholders in order to avoid the charge that really what he's doing is engaging in an advocacy of corporate social responsibility. So this argument is valid, but is it sound? It's not, and for a couple reasons. So the first reason is that P1 is false. So suppose that a corporate executive poses a new project, and they pose it with the following in mind. They're going to generate some percentage of the revenue earned by that project to an important environmental charity, right? It's not the case that that money would have gone to stockholders otherwise, because the project didn't exist by stipulation in any circumstance where that sort of socially responsible project wasn't being engaged, right? In this story we're talking about, the corporate executive came up with the project with the intention of donating some of the money to a environmental cause. So it's just not the case that every time a corporate executive engages in a socially responsible project, he or she will spend money that otherwise would have gone to stockholders. And if we expand it to the other groups that Friedman mentioned originally, like your customers and your employees, the same result obtains. Right? In this particular story, it's just not the case that that money would have gone to the employees or to the customers. The project wouldn't have existed at all in this story unless the money was going to go to the environmental charity. So premise 1 is not true. I'm just going to grant premise 2 for the sake of argument. I'm not going to fight it. But I'll register that I'm a little bit ambivalent. It doesn't seem exactly that taxation is the right way of talking about a corporate executive using money that they otherwise would have given to a customer in the form of lower prices as taxation. But I'll grant it for the sake of argument. But I want to focus on premise 3. So premise 3 says it is wrong in principle for corporate executives to engage in taxation. Now, Friedman gives two different defenses of premise 3. The first defense has to do with the idea that there is a separation of powers. So in the United States government, the executive branch and the legislative branch are two separate branches of government. You don't have the same branch passing and executing the laws. The second defense that Friedman gives of premise 3 is that you shouldn't have taxation without representation. And that was sort of a big battle cry of the United States Revolutionary War. Now, the thing is, there are all sorts of criteria that we expect governments to meet that we don't expect corporations to meet. There's also criteria that we expect corporations to meet that we don't expect the government to meet. So just because something is a good-making feature when it's found in a government, that doesn't mean that it's a good-making feature when it's found in a corporation. For example, take freedom of speech. Now, I expect the government to protect my freedom of speech. I expect the government to not come in and punish me if I wear a shirt that has an obscene word on it. But if I wear a shirt that has a swear word on it inside of the workplace, I might get fired. And it seems like corporations have a legitimate interest in maintaining particular kinds of office climates that don't tolerate that kind of language. And so we often have different requirements for the government than we do for corporations. And so just because Friedman can point to the separation of powers in the federal government and say there's an executive branch and there's a legislative branch, and the executive branch executes the laws and the legislative branch writes the laws, that doesn't mean that we should expect the same thing to happen in corporations. So the first defense of premise 3, it is wrong in principle for corporate executives to engage in taxation, falls apart. But let's talk about the second one. So the second defense has to do with taxation without representation. Now, it's true that stockholders in a corporation don't vote directly for corporate executives, but what they do vote for is the board of directors. And when we look at the like the federal government or state government, it's analogous. So citizens don't typically vote directly for legislation. Sometimes they will. In really rare cases, you'll have like a referendum vote. And that's analogous to situations where in a corporation you might have all the stockholders voting on some important policy decision. But typically what the stockholders are doing is that they're voting on the members of the board of directors. And that's kind of like how United States citizens vote for senators. And the senators are the ones who actually pass the laws, propose and pass the laws. They also vote for president. And what the president will do is they'll appoint people to positions. They'll appoint like Supreme Court justices, for example. But so, it seems pretty analogous. In both the case of the corporation with the stockholders and the United States citizens, you're typically not voting directly for like all of the positions and all the policies, but you're voting for some of the policies, and you're voting for the people who are going to enact the policies that you're not voting for. Okay, so it seems like that defense of premise 3 also falls apart, even if we accept that we want corporations to match governments in the sense that they don't have taxation without representation. So we don't have a good defense of premise 3. Premise 3 might be true, but Friedman hasn't done a good job of showing us that it's true. So that's premise 3. Now let's talk about premise 4. So premise 4 is that the practical consequences of corporate executives engaging in taxation are bad. And the main argument for that is as follows. Corporate executives get hired to be corporate executives because they're really good at business. They don't get hired to be executives because they're really good at picking charities and understanding which kinds of socially responsible projects it is good to engage in. And so for that reason, it's a really bad idea to have corporate executives being the ones making these decisions about like allocating funds towards socially responsible causes. But that argument is really weak. It's just as weak as the other ones that we just looked at. It's weak because, first of all, a corporate executive could easily be, go to some trainings and learn more about socially responsible causes. So if the worry is just that they don't have the training, well, they can get the training if they really want it. But it's even easier than that, because in a whole lot of areas of business, executives and other parts of companies will call in outside consultants when there's an issue that they're not an expert in, where they really need to make an important decision. And so there's no reason to think that they can't call in an expert here if they need to have some more advice about which causes to support and how to support those causes, right? And so if really what you're worried about is expertise, it's not clear, like that's just not an obstacle that can't be overcome. It can be overcome fairly easily. So we don't have a successful defense of either conclusion 1 or conclusion 2. All right. So that was a look at some arguments from Friedman's piece. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do now is to take the approach that I've used on the arguments that I've looked at, find some more arguments from Friedman's paper, and I want you to assess the quality of those arguments by yourself. So first, represent them in sort of break them down to their parts, clearly express those parts, and then I want you to assess whether the arguments that result from that are valid. And then if they're valid, I want you to assess whether those arguments are sound. So do that for at least one argument from Friedman's article so that you can do some exploration on your own. All right, thank you, and I hope you have a great day.